So we're getting ready to put solar on our house today. We're really pretty excited about it. The project will take place over a couple days. I'm filming this in bits. We started looking at this project about 5 years ago to put solar on our house, and it really didn't make any sense. We had cheap electricity here in Houston. We were paying about 6 cents a kilowatt hour, which was phenomenal at the time. And over the last 5 years, that price has about doubled. We had some door-to-door salespeople come to our door back in the day. That used to be encyclopedias and Cutco knives and Kirby vacuum cleaners, for those of you that remember all of those things. And today they're selling solar. So these guys came up and said, hey, would you talk to us about solar? And spent about 30 minutes with their team and got a ridiculous quote after about 30 minutes for almost $100,000 for something like 12 kW of solar, which doesn't make any sense. But there were a couple of really interesting things. The federal solar tax credit is out now in the U.S., which allows you to take about 30% of the cost of installation back as a tax credit. So I started doing some research, and I started with, as every engineer might, I started with Excel. And I'll walk you through some sheets. We pulled from Google the average amount of solar days and solar hours that hits our roof. And we started looking at the math, and you can kind of make it make sense. It's not overwhelming, but if you look forward, so 5 years ago we were paying 7 cents a kilowatt hour. Now we're paying 12.5 to 15. My theory is that jumps significantly up to about 20 to 30 cents a kilowatt hour as we go forward. And then solar really does make sense. The really interesting thing that I found is we got about 30 quotes for this project. Is all of the quotes seem to exactly match the savings. So my theory is today solar will cost you X and you'll save X, and tomorrow solar will cost you Y and save you Y. They seem to balance cost and value together to their benefit. So we're going to go ahead and move forward, but there are a bunch of questions. Which solar panels do we use? Which microinverters do we use? Where do we put them? And so this project will kind of be a very technical review of all of that with some unanswered questions. Part of it, what we're going to do is we looked at solar panels. We looked at a bunch of different providers. A lot of them are very, very similar, but today in 2023, most of the quotes were coming out with Q-Cell, but you see a few from REC and a few other providers, and I wasn't really certain which one was going to be the best for our roof. And so in this case, we're going to put up both. We're going to put up some panels of one provider and some panels of the other. And because we're using the ENPHASE micro inverters, the IQ8s, they're actually the IQ8As, and we'll get into that in a bit. We should be able to track the total usage provided by each panel and answer some questions that I couldn't get when I was building this project. I couldn't understand which one was actually going to produce more. Weather temperature mattered. Today it's only about 90 degrees. Early in this week it's been 100, 103. So it's hot in Texas, and things like temperature degradation on the PV cells matter. But I don't know how much, and we're about to find out. So if you follow along, I'll show you which panels are producing best, which ones matter in terms of temperature, how it deals with things like shade from the trees you see behind me. All that we'll cover as we go through this project. So we're back inside now. We're looking at the Excel that we built out for this project. And this started pretty simply. We started looking at, okay, from Google, I said, well, how many peak hours of sunlight do most people have? And the answer was 6. I don't know how many sites for that, but that's where I started. I picked a power per panel. This was just a sticker power off of a lot of panels, the Q-Cell, the REC. A lot of them are publishing around a 400 watt panel efficiency. So I threw that one in. And then there was a lot of study on the efficiency of each of the panels, and people recommended that you downgrade it by about 25%. So you see 75% efficiency. Then I went to Google's Project Power, Project Solar. I'll walk you through what I did there. And it said that based on my location, I got about 1,800 hours of daily watt hours. Didn't really look into that. I've been told by some of the providers that that number is too high, but that got me started. And that gave me a weekly and a monthly version, and then simple version of calculating out this divided by 1,000 gave me my 12.6 kilowatts per week. I wanted to generate 500 kilowatts on a weekly basis and 2,000 on a monthly, and that was based on our estimated usage. Some simple math led me to the number of panels, and then it led me to a total system size, which is the number of panels times the sticker. And I was looking for about a 16 or a 15 kilowatt hour system. That's something to put on my house. So I needed about 40 panels. When I started asking and looking for quotes, that's where I started. Now, this is what I was talking about earlier. This is Google's Project Sunroof, which is a bit aged. I think this is probably about 5 years old. But if you put in your address, we'll tell you how many hours of usable sunlight you get, what kind of square footage you have on your roof. We've got a really big roof here, but we don't have a lot of great space for solar. Some of our neighbors have less complex roofs, so that makes it a little bit easier. Ours is reasonably complex, and we've got a lot of forward facing. You see we've got some big trees around our property, which makes collecting solar a bit more challenging. Project Sunroof also makes an attempt to give you some view of how much money you can save. So you put in your average utility bill, and the first time you get any quote from any solar provider, they're going to ask for this number. That'll give you an estimate for how much solar you need, and they'll go through and show you the economics on how much that's going to cost. Now, these are all generic out of the can estimates from Google, which tells me that this is a $45,000 system for a 16.5 kW. There's a tax incentive, which really is the only thing that makes the economics behind this work. And they say over 20 years, if we buy this, we'll save $13,000. Unless you figure out that you have a net present value of spending that money now, in which case you're going to lose money installing a 16 kW system for this price. The next step was to get a little bit more scientific. Fortunately for us, the National Renewable Energies Lab offers the free version of their PV calculations to just about anybody that'll download it. You have to go to their website, create an account, register, do a whole bunch of different things, but you can download both simple things. PV Watts is a pretty easy one to use, or you can download their full software so you can do your own management of your projects as you go along. All right, so once you make it into SAM, you either have to create a new file or open one that you've built already. First thing you need to do is tell it where you are. So you put in your location, you hit download. So you can use lat and longitude, make the most sense for this. And as soon as you do that, it'll create a file for you so that it knows where you are. And then you can come in and say, okay, I'm going to put in, this is the nameplate capacity. We said on the Excel sheet that we wanted at least 15 to generate the power we were going to generate. But as we progressed through this project, we ended up at this 18. And then this DC to AC ratio, you can find that on some of the sheets, but this is where it got a little tricky. We're like, okay, what does this actually mean? And I'm not sure that this defaults in there, but this is where we started. This gave you a rated inverter size. So this is the AC power, not the DC power. And it said, okay, based on this, you're going to need 85 square meters of panel, and has an inverter efficiency. All of this I kind of left empty. Installation costs, if you want to run through your numbers here, it'll give you some numbers. I ignored most of that, including the financial piece, some of the tax incentive. You could throw in your electricity rates, But where it gets interesting is, okay, you hit the simulate button, and now you have a little bit more reliable data. So this says I can generate 26,000 kilowatt hours for our system, which I'd say is probably an overestimate. This assumes there's no shade, there's no problem with anything crossing over your panels, and I would call this the absolute max that you would generate. So I kind of like this. This tells you where it is. You can get data tables. You can create graphs and look at, okay, what do my monthly AC output look like per month. You can look at it by hour. So here's a day in July. Based on our weather file, it pulls out how much generating power we're pulling together. So here's this particular day, and it assumes some clouds came over, it rained on us or something. This is a normal day, so you see your peak system generating is 12, and it starts at 6 o'clock in the morning. By 6 o'clock at night, you're done. There's nothing more. And this gets interesting because if you know how much power you're using on an hourly basis, you know that you may be about 5, and everything above 5 is excess. Well, that becomes interesting because at some point in time, you got to sell it back to the grid or store it in power. And so understanding your average usage and power becomes handy as you try to figure out where you can pull in value out of this system that's not shown. But as you go through the years and look at what's going on here, you can kind of see what's going on. Now, we haven't discussed clipping yet, and we'll get into that in a bit. But here's how the power progresses. If we make it down to December, you've got some low days. January is reasonably low, and then if you go in your monthly data, let's see if we can make it back to monthly data somehow. You can get some more interesting views. I kind of ignored. Here's your monthly data, so it thinks we can pull in. I think that's about 1,800 in January, and it maxes out at 25. And as you recall, when we were targeting this system, we wanted 2,000. And so I think this gives us about 2,000 a month. So the residential version of that was interesting, but I really felt like I was making some guesses I wasn't prepared to be making. So I went through and said, well, let's look at the utility model, which is a bit more complex version of the other piece. But then you can start picking which solar panel you want. So here's the REC 405 Pures, which is what we decided to put on our system, and it does all the default calculations on what this system actually does and what the PV works with. And just about every solar panel you can imagine is in here. The Q cells are in here, others are in here. And then you also get to pick your inverter. And so here's our ENPHASE 8A, which all of the details on that are in here. And then you can put in your system design. I mentioned we have a complicated system. And so here's our number of inverters, here's our AC to DC ratio. That gives us 18.2 and a total AC capacity of almost 16. And then I went ahead and did 4 separate arrays. Now I did this in 4 separate arrays because I was looking at north, south, east, and west. And you can see at some point in time you control what the azimuth of each of these systems could be. You can do some shading. I didn't do any shading as I went through it. It'll calculate losses through your electrical as you're going through and looking at mismatch and other pieces. I left this at the default. And then you can go through and do all the financial pieces, depreciation, and then look at your output. But you saw in the residential version, it had us at 26. This brings us down to 25. And you get slightly a different view on when you're going to produce AC as you go through it. So here it says that January through April will be about 15 to 2,000, and then through the summer months we're above the $2,000 mark, and then back down in December. The details here, and the utility model gets a lot more detailed, but I wanted to show this. So this is on the top. This is the power generated by your solar array throughout a particular day, and here we've just got some random day in July here in Texas. But all of the panels talk about their rated or sticker panel performance at 1,000 watts per meter squared of irradiance. And you can see that based on our weather file that we put in and the directions of our panel, we're only getting that for a few hours out of the day. The rest of that is a curve that goes through it. And you can kind of look through most of your days, you're well under the 1,000. I don't know, maybe you could tell me in the comments below what each one of these lines from the weather file calculated, you know, GHI versus POA, I don't know. But what I do know is the 400 watt sticker on the panel looks to be a little bit misunderstood, because we're not going to get that on the majority of our days. Here we're a day in October, we peak out at 700. Now obviously these are, you know, based on your location and where you are, and this day, you know, we get everything from down here to up here. I don't know what the differences are, but this is a nice generated curve. This looks to be a great day in terms of the power that we pull in. But here it goes up. We only get full power from about 9 to about 15, and the rest of the day you're kind of at the scope of whatever ends up happening. And these details aren't available in the residential model. You've got to go to the utility model to see this. I like these little charts here. These show the power produced on every month on average. This is, you know, through the course of a day, and you can kind of get a feel when you're pulling power. This gets interesting if you understand how you're using power. So, you know, we start typically at about 1,000 kilowatts and then peak up to 5. But on just about every occasion, we're going to be selling a significant amount of power back to the grid. And so as we started thinking about how much or what type of power system we wanted to pull in, what our contract would look like with the electricity company, it became pretty clear that we're going to be using a lot of power before the solar kicks in and selling it back as it went back to the grid on other parts of the day. So we need to understand this in order to figure out how to properly not only size the system, but, you know, run the economics on what a plan would actually look like. All right, so now let's look at inverters. Obviously a bunch of different choices you can do with inverters, but the ENPHASE microinverters are what most people are quoting at this point. So here we've got 4 inverters. We've got the ability to pick our inverter. We've got an IQ8A. This is the 8A. There's also an M and an 8 Plus, and we'll go through each one of those as we kind of think about these. But all of the inputs for each one of these is stored in the National Renewable Energy Labs page, so you can really get a good view of what these things look like. So this is the one we selected, which is the A, and that's the largest of the inverters that's reasonably available. You can go a little bit bigger with ENPHASE, but I don't think you need to, and you'll see why here in a second. So this shows a 795 kilowatt hours. Everything here is the same between these 3 models. The only thing that's different is the module that's being put on here. As you look at the losses and you scroll down, you see the inverter power clipping is down at 0. But if you go back over to the the 8 Plus, which is most of what people are going to quote, you can see you're going to lose about 1% and 3/4% to power clipping. And what ends up happening is you look at the time series, there's parts of the year where the panels are putting out more than the inverter can handle, and the inverter trims it down, and you can see that happening here, here, and here. Oddly, at least according to this model, and I don't know if I believe this model, we're not seeing it in the peak sun hours. Something's got to be off here. But that's what's showing up in the model here. But I think generally speaking, there may be a shift or an offset as you go through here. But here you've got some clipping. If you go over the M, which is slightly bigger, and do the same thing, you've really truncated down. And if you go over to the A and look at the same piece, you can see that you've completely eliminated all of your clipping. Now, each one of these steps may have a price increase for you. It depends on what they're selling their inverters for, how much more money they want to charge you. But if you can get incremental gains in your power on something that's so tight on the financials, it's important to maximize it. But you certainly don't want to maximize your inverter technology, because your maximum gain between the best one that's out there and the one that's most commonly quoted, which is the IQ8 plus, that IQ8 plus is only going to give you the difference about 1 percentage point in terms of yield. And if you look at the summary, here we're getting 25,795, and on the 8 plus we're getting 25,000. So there's really 700 kilowatt hours over the course of a year, based on these estimates, is all you're really yielding. Now the other one you want to look at is, what panel do I use? And the nice thing about this software is it allows you to go in and pick your module. So here is the Q-Cells Duo Black 400, which is a very common panel that's out there. This is the same panel I was quoted a number of different times. It's the same panel Tesla puts on their roof, and it goes through and does all of that work. At the same time, I went and looked at the REC. So here's exactly the same situation with the REC and the Q-Cells, and looked at the difference between them. And we looked at this number a number of times. It's using the plus version, but this is a 25,000. And if you go and look at the Hanwha, the Q-Cells, it's a 25,000. Now we've got two panels that are rated differently. They'll tell you the REC is a better panel. It's got slightly more power per panel, but in these simulations, it's exactly the same. And I think you'll find that the difference between the REC panel and the Q-Cells panel is negligible at best. What we're going to do on our house is try to figure it out. So we're putting the two different panels on the house. We're going to primarily put the RECs on the house because they've got a better temperature rating, and are a little bit smaller on our complex roof. But in some places, we're actually going to put the Q-Cell Duo 400 on there and see if we can see a difference in how much power is generated. And because the ENPHASE systems allow us to track cumulative energy by system, it'll allow us to do this exercise without a lot of effort, and I'll be able to show you whether or not we get an incremental gain from, quote unquote, the better panel. So the team over at Texas Direct Solar really did a pretty good job. This is what our system looks like. You've seen from the drone footage, we've got a rather complex roof. Here are 45 panels spread throughout. Showed you on other occasions some of the other plans, but this is how we ended up looking at it. This is the overview of the house. Obviously over here, you've got the automatic transfer switches, and the solar is going to go over here in the corner. But it turns into 5 different arrays. It kind of felt like more than that, as they're separated out into a bunch of different little systems. But each one of these has about 9 panels on them, or maybe exactly 9 panels on each one of these systems. So you've got the blue, the green, the salmon, the yellow, and the light blue coming across the house. And like we discussed earlier, some of these we're going to replace with the Q-Cells version to try to get a direct comparison between the RECs and the Q-Cells. But here's how the system looks. You've got the Iron Ridge details. Here are the automatic transfer switches. And then the new system is going to be the new solar load center, plus the disconnect, fusible disconnect going into the gutter box. Some line drawings, one line drawings that goes through how they put it together. So it's going to go from the panels into a junction box into the solar load centers, including some monitoring through the fusible disconnect, and then into the generators, gutter box, and meters. So if this all gets handled this way. Some labels that need to be created. There's our generator, power switches, and then this is required by the Houston permitting district to select which particular panel you're putting on. Here we're putting in these Pure Series 405s, which are selected here. And here you can see we're putting in the IQ8As. As you look here, there's a difference between the pluses and the A's. We talked about that as you looked at the solar panels. And mainly that has to do with where the peak hour output is. The 8 pluses are limited at 300, while the 8As go to 366. And when you get that perfect irradiance over 1,000, you'll see clipping here and you won't see it here. What'll be interesting to me is when you look at the maximum power point tracking voltage, that MPPT piece. So here, the larger AQs or IQ8As can only do maximum power point tracking from 36 to 45, while the A pluses can go all the way down to 29. And I'm assuming that these might be able to do a better job at doing the maximum power point tracking on the roof. And I might talk to the guys over at Texas Direct to see if we put a couple of 8 pluses in the systems to see if there is a real difference in the generating capacity between the 8As and the 8 pluses. Might be a little interesting piece to look at as we go through it. The last piece, as you look through here, are the spec sheets on the panels that are going in. And we're putting in the Iron Ridge systems as the rail, the XR10s. All right, so you've made it this far. You've watched like 25 minutes of video on an engineer's view on the solar plant. So let's see what happens. Who's going to win? Is it going to be Q-Cell? Is it going to be REC? Do we really need the 8As, or can we get away with the pluses? We're about to find out. So follow along with the next video, and we'll show you the install, and then we'll cover all of the details as it goes through.